When federal marshals kicked in the door, Margaret Garner's hands were still stained with her daughter's blood. That's the part the Cincinnati papers wouldn't publish in February 1856. At least not the complete truth. They labeled it a domestic tragedy. An unfortunate incident, they called it. What they refused to call it was what it truly was. The instant when America's most protected secret came hurtling across a frozen river and landed wailing in a courtroom where nobody was prepared to listen. 28 witnesses saw what unfolded in that tiny cabin on Mill Creek. Every single one told a different version. The records were locked away. The testimonies contradicted each other. The trial documents, the ones that survived, had been so thoroughly altered they could have been works of fiction. But there's a reason historians still grow uneasy at Margaret Garner's name. There's a reason her trial was concealed beneath legal terminology and procedural stalling until it faded from memory. Because Margaret's actions that winter dawn did more than defy the law. They revealed the single truth the whole system was designed to conceal. And tonight, you'll discover what they attempted to delete from history. Before we move forward with Margaret Garner's story and the secret that almost ripped a nation in half, I need you to do something. If stories that expose history's hidden chapters draw you in, the ones they wanted buried, press that subscribe button now and drop a comment telling me your location, because this narrative extends further than you realize. Now, let's return to the beginning. Kentucky, 1856. The Ohio River separated more than just land. It cleaved the world down the middle. On one bank, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, where people were possessions, and the law declared it in ink. On the opposite bank, Ohio, where freedom supposedly held meaning. But freedom, as Margaret Garner would discover, shifted its definition based on your side of the water. The river was alive, transforming with each season. During summer months, it moved sluggishly and brown, laden with sediment from upstream farms. When winter arrived, it froze thick enough for walking, provided you had sufficient bravery or desperation. The ice moaned and split under its weight, moving through the dark like something struggling to awaken. Locals claimed you could hear it after nightfall, a deep groaning that traveled over the water into the slave quarters lining both shores. Some believed it was merely the ice. Others insisted it was the chorus of those who'd attempted the crossing and vanished. Around 1834, Margaret was born into slavery at the Maplewood Plantation in Boone County. The precise date went unrecorded. Slave births weren't deemed worthy of exact documentation. Her mother, Priscilla, had arrived there as a young girl, bought at an estate auction in Lexington after the former owner's death when his holdings were sold off. Priscilla never discussed her own mother, the family she'd been ripped from, the existence she'd known before Maplewood. That was slavery's work. It cut you from your history so thoroughly that eventually you quit attempting to recall. Margaret's father. His name stayed unspoken, yet everyone understood. Archibald K. Gaines, the master's son, had his habits of moving through the quarters after dark, and the babies born 9 months afterward bore his features. Margaret numbered among them. Fair-skinned with penetrating eyes that appeared to look through you, and an intelligence that unsettled the overseers. Slaves weren't meant to think excessively. Thinking bred questions. Questions bred problems. Maplewood didn't rank as Boone County's biggest plantation, but its size was impressive. More than 800 acres of tobacco, corn, and hemp cultivated by 53 enslaved individuals. The master's house stood 2 stories, brick construction with white pillars, designed in the federal architecture fashionable in Kentucky then. It occupied a hilltop above the fields, strategically placed so anyone on the front veranda could survey the entire distance to the quarters, an intentional arrangement guaranteeing perpetual observation. The quarters formed a line of cramped cabins, each sheltering several families. Walls ran thin, roofs dripped, and winter winds sliced through the board gaps like blades. Margaret's childhood unfolded in the 3rd cabin from the row's end, sharing it with her mother, 2 aunts, and 7 additional children. Privacy didn't exist as a concept. You mastered sleeping through others' nightmares, disregarding crying sounds, pretending blindness to the bruises marking your neighbors after the overseer's visits. At 19, she married Robert Garner. He was owned by a neighboring plantation, belonging to James Marshall. The 2 estates permitted their enslaved populations to establish unions. It anchored them, reduced flight risks. The ceremony held no legal validity, naturally. Kentucky law gave slave marriages no recognition, but the community honored them, which mattered. They jumped the broom before witnesses, exchanged vows both knew a master could shatter instantly on a whim, and attempted building something like a life. Robert was darker complected than Margaret, wide-shouldered, hands marked by years laboring in Marshall's tobacco fields. He possessed a quiet resilience, the type earned from enduring what should have been fatal. He'd been sold twice previously, once as a boy, torn from his mother, then again as an adolescent when his initial owner died and the estate was split among inheritors. He'd learned against attachment to locations or individuals, because attachment meant suffering. But he loved Margaret with the intensity of someone who knows love is his only permitted possession. 4 children came. Mary, their eldest, was approaching 3, an intelligent, inquisitive child carrying her mother's eyes and her father's grin. Thomas and Samuel, the boys, were 2 and 1, still mastering walking, still innocent enough to consider the world safe. And Priscilla, the infant, named for Margaret's mother, was merely 9 months, still nursing, still tiny enough to nestle in Margaret's arms curve. Margaret loved her children with an intensity that scared her. She'd heard the accounts, mothers whose children were auctioned off, who witnessed them hauled to selling blocks and never glimpsed them again. She'd observed women descend into madness with grief, watched them refuse food, refuse speech, refuse life. She'd sworn to herself it wouldn't touch her family. She'd vowed to do anything necessary to protect her children. Maplewood life followed its unchanging pattern, days flowing into each other, distinguished only by seasons and the master's temperament. You rose before sunrise, labored until your hands split, consumed whatever scraps were provided, and dropped into sleep so profound it resembled drowning. Sundays were designated rest days, though rest remained relative. Mending always needed doing, meals required preparation, children demanded care. The labor never genuinely ceased. John Pollard Gaines, the plantation's owner, wasn't Kentucky's most brutal master. That was the terrible part. He was unremarkable. He didn't beat his slaves fatally or deny them food. He didn't split families unless circumstances demanded it. He simply possessed them, like someone owns farm equipment or livestock, and anticipated their gratitude for their chain's mercy. He visited church each Sunday, sang hymns celebrating Christian compassion, and returned home to meals prepared by people with no alternative but serving him. He perceived no inconsistency in this. Most didn't. But winter 1856 brought change. Gaines had accumulated debt. The tobacco market had crashed. Values had plummeted. And he'd invested poorly in railroad shares that never paid dividends. Whispers circulated through the quarters. He was liquidating land parcels, converting assets, and assets in Kentucky meant people. Margaret learned the rumors initially from Priscilla, who'd heard from the house servants. Gaines intended selling some slaves southward. South signified the Deep South. South meant Mississippi cotton fields, Louisiana sugar plantations, South Carolina rice plantations, locations where enslaved people were worked to death within 5 years and replaced with fresh auction block purchases. The Deep South carried a reputation, and that reputation was constructed from bones. The dread settling over the quarters was palpable enough to taste. Sleep became impossible. They monitored the main house, seeking signs, attempting to predict who'd be selected. The overseer began compiling lists, touring the cabins with a ledger, conducting inventory. Margaret's name appeared on that list. Robert's did too. The children's as well. Her decision crystallized on a January evening when temperatures plunged below freezing and the Ohio River transformed to ice. The plan assembled through whispers, transmitted cabin to cabin in the night's depths when the overseer slept and the dogs stayed quiet. Robert had contacted Elijah Kite, a free black man residing across the river in Cincinnati. Kite had community recognition, not publicly, but through the coded exchanges and deliberate silences that transmitted important information. He assisted runaways. He belonged to the network, the unseen chain of safe locations and sympathetic people extending from slave states to Canada. 3 days prior, the river had frozen solid. The ice was substantial enough to support a man's weight, possibly even a wagon with care. It represented a rare chance. The river didn't freeze like this annually. And when it did, it remained frozen briefly. If they intended running, it had to be immediately. They departed just past midnight on January 27, 1856. Margaret, Robert, their 4 children, and Robert's parents, Simon and Mary, both in their 60s. Both excessively aged for nighttime flight, but too terrified of being sold to remain. 9 individuals total, advancing through darkness like phantoms, escaping the light. Margaret held baby Priscilla bundled in a threadbare blanket, their only one. The cold was savage, the variety that seared your lungs with each breath and numbed your fingers within minutes. Mary clutched Robert's hand, her tiny legs fighting to maintain pace. Thomas and Samuel were borne by their grandparents, wrapped against cold, their faces nearly invisible beneath cloth layers. They advanced silently. Sound traveled at night, particularly in winter when air hung still and the world froze. A dog's bark might mean discovery. A child's whimper might mean death. Margaret had administered an herbal mixture to the children earlier, something Priscilla had taught her, something to keep them sleepy and silent. It carried danger. Excessive amounts could prove fatal, though not as dangerous as capture. The fields extended around them, barren and white beneath moonlight. The tobacco stalks had been harvested months earlier, leaving just stubble and frozen soil. Distantly, the main house sat darkened and quiet, its windows resembling hollow eyes observing their departure. Margaret refused looking backward. Looking backward meant bad fortune. Looking backward suggested lack of commitment. Looking backward suggested possible reconsideration. They arrived at the river shortly before 1 a.m. The ice extended before them, an enormous stretch of black glass mirroring the stars. It appeared solid, but Margaret understood better. Ice deceived. It could support you one instant and consume you the next. People had perished attempting this river crossing. Their remains surfaced in spring when ice thawed, swollen and unidentifiable, deposited on banks like driftwood. Robert proceeded first, testing the ice with every step, listening for the warning crack signaling danger. The ice groaned under him, a profound sound appearing to originate from the earth. He gestured for the others to follow, dispersing themselves to spread the weight. Margaret stepped onto ice, sensing it shift under her feet, and began walking. The crossing consumed 20 minutes, though it seemed endless. Each step became a prayer. Each breath became a wager. The baby shifted in Margaret's arms, producing small noises, and Margaret drew her nearer, murmuring calming words the wind stole away. Mary slipped once, her feet sliding out, and Robert grabbed her before she struck ice. The sound of her near fall reverberated across the river like a gunshot, and they all froze, waiting to determine if anyone had noticed. Nobody came. The Kentucky shore stayed dark and quiet. They continued moving. They succeeded in crossing. That was the first miracle. Margaret's feet contacted Ohio ground. Free ground, they named it, though she didn't experience freedom yet. And she permitted herself one instant of relief. One instant believing that perhaps, just perhaps, they would survive this. The second miracle was Elijah Kite's house sitting exactly where they'd been informed. A modest cabin on Mill Creek just beyond Cincinnati, set back from the road and concealed by trees. Kite answered the door before they could knock as though he'd been expecting them. He was tall, thin with gray hair and eyes that had witnessed too much. He guided them inside wordlessly, shut the door, and secured it. The cabin was modest, merely 2 rooms, but warmth filled it. A fire blazed in the hearth and the scent of food. Genuine food, not the leftovers they knew, permeated the air. Kite's wife, a woman named Sarah, delivered them bread and soup, and they consumed it silently, too drained to speak. The children collapsed into sleep almost instantly, curled on blankets beside the fire. Robert's parents occupied the corner, hands clasped, their faces empty with shock. They'd succeeded. Against impossible odds, they'd actually succeeded. Kite explained the plan. They'd rest several hours, then depart at sunrise for the next station, a farm roughly 20 miles north, owned by Quakers who'd conceal them in a false-bottomed wagon and transport them further along the line. From there, it became a series of leaps, each bringing them nearer to Canada. It would require weeks, perhaps months, but possibility existed. People accomplished it regularly. They could manage it too. Margaret allowed herself hope just slightly. Just enough to envision a future where her children matured free, where they learned reading and writing, where they selected their own directions. It was a perilous thing, hope. It rendered you vulnerable. But in that instant, in that heated cabin with her family secure around her, she permitted herself belief. She shouldn't have. The knock arrived at dawn. Not a courteous knock, a pounding aggressive, the noise of fists and rifle stocks against wood. Voices yelled from outside, demanding entrance, invoking the law. Margaret's eyes flew open, and she immediately understood what had occurred. Someone had spotted them. Someone had spoken. Someone had betrayed them. Robert was already standing, advancing toward the door, attempting to bar it. But it was too late. The door exploded open, ripped from its frame, and the marshals flooded in like water. There were 6, all white men, all armed, all displaying the badges granting them authority to haul human beings back into bondage. Behind them, positioned in the doorway with expressions of severe satisfaction, were John Pollard Gaines and James Marshall. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was explicit. Runaways possessed no rights. They could be captured without trial, without testimony, without defense. The law was indifferent if you'd reached Ohio. The law was indifferent if you'd touched free ground. The law declared you were property, and property required returning to its rightful owner. One marshal seized Robert, hurling him against the wall. Another targeted Simon, who attempted resistance and was struck across the face with a rifle stock. Mary shrieked. The baby began wailing. The cabin exploded into chaos, bodies and voices and the stench of terror. Margaret moved quicker than anyone anticipated. She seized a butcher knife from the table, a long, heavy blade Kite's wife had been using for bread, and pivoted toward her children. Subsequently, witnesses would dispute what happened next. Some claimed she screamed. Others claimed she was silent. But everyone concurred on what she did. She grabbed Mary by the arm, drew her close, and slashed her throat. The blood arrived fast, a brilliant red arc that sprayed across the cabin wall and splashed onto the floor. Mary's body went slack in Margaret's arms, her small hands reaching up toward her mother's face, her eyes wide with confusion, and then nothing. The marshals froze, too stunned to act. The room fell silent, except for blood dripping onto the wooden floor, a steady rhythm resembling a clock ticking. Margaret turned toward the other children, the knife still gripped in her hand, her face expressionless. She advanced toward Thomas, reaching for him, and that's when the marshals recovered. 2 tackled her to the ground, slamming her face first into the floor. The knife skidded away, leaving a blood trail. Robert lunged forward, attempting to reach her, but he was beaten back, struck repeatedly until he fell. Simon and Mary were hauled into the corner. The baby was torn from Sarah Kite's arms, screaming. Margaret didn't resist. She lay on the floor, her hands restrained behind her back, her face pressed against wood, and stared at her daughter's body. Mary's blood was pooling around her, spreading gradually, seeping into the floorboard cracks. Her eyes remained open, staring at nothing. One marshal, a man named John Jolliffe, stood above Margaret and demanded explanation for what she'd done. Margaret looked up at him, her face smeared with blood, some Mary's, some her own from where she'd been struck, and spoke the words that would torment the nation for decades. I will not let them take my children back into slavery. I will kill them all first. The room erupted again. Gaines was shouting, demanding Margaret be restrained, that the other children be secured. Marshall was yelling at the marshals, accusing them of incompetence. Elijah Kite was attempting to explain, attempting to defend himself, saying he didn't know. He had no idea she'd do something like this. But his words were consumed by the chaos. Mary's body was shrouded with a blanket. The other children were collected, still weeping, still reaching for their mother. Margaret was hauled to her feet, her hands secured with rope and guided outside. A crowd had assembled. Neighbors, curious spectators, people who'd heard the disturbance and come to investigate what was happening. They gazed at Margaret as she was loaded into a wagon, their faces mixing horror and fascination. The newspapers would subsequently describe the scene as a tragedy of unimaginable scale. They would label Margaret a monster, a mad woman, a cautionary tale of what occurred when enslaved people were given ideas beyond their station. But in that instant, as the wagon departed and Margaret looked back at the cabin where her daughter's body still lay, she felt nothing, no regret, no grief, just a cold, hollow certainty that she had done the right thing because she knew what slavery was. She'd lived it. She'd survived it. And she knew with a certainty that no free person could ever comprehend, that death was a mercy. The trial commenced on January 28, 1856, fewer than 24 hours following Mary's death. It should have been straightforward. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, Margaret and her family were property, and property didn't receive trials. They were to be returned to their owners instantly, no questions posed, no delays authorized. The law was crafted to be swift and efficient, to discourage runaways by rendering escape functionally impossible. But something unexpected occurred. Ohio charged Margaret with murder. It was a legal contradiction nobody had foreseen. If Margaret was property, as federal law asserted, then she couldn't be charged with murder. Property couldn't perpetrate crimes. Animals didn't face trial when they killed. Tools didn't encounter justice when they caused injury. If Margaret was a thing, then what she'd done was no different than a plow breaking or a horse going lame. But if she was a person capable of facing trial, capable of being held responsible for her actions, then she couldn't be property. The case transformed into a battleground, not concerning Margaret's guilt, but concerning her humanity. The courtroom was crowded from day one. The trial was conducted in the Hamilton County Courthouse in Cincinnati, an impressive building with marble pillars and elevated ceilings that amplified every word. Abolitionists viewed Margaret as a symbol, a mother pushed to the unthinkable by slavery's horrors. Evidence that the institution was so wicked it transformed human beings into monsters. Pro-slavery supporters viewed her as evidence that enslaved people were violent, irrational, unsuited for freedom, dangerous without proper control. The newspapers published daily coverage, each more sensational than the previous. Margaret's face featured in sketches, her expression blank, inscrutable. She didn't weep. She didn't beg. She simply occupied the defendant's chair and waited. Her attorney was a man named John Jolliffe, a distinguished abolitionist lawyer who'd built a career defending runaways. He was in his 50s with gray hair and a voice that could dominate a room. He'd argued numerous fugitive slave cases, won some, lost most, but never quit fighting. He perceived Margaret's case as an opportunity, not merely to preserve her life, but to reveal the fundamental contradiction at American slavery's core. Jolliffe's argument was straightforward. Margaret should face murder charges in Ohio, not be returned to Kentucky. If she was convicted, she would hang, but she would hang as a free woman acknowledged by the law as a human being with agency and accountability. If she was returned to Kentucky, she would survive, but she would survive as property, and her surviving children would remain enslaved. It was a selection between death with dignity and life in chains. Margaret made her selection clear. She wanted the murder trial. She wanted to hang. The prosecution was directed by federal attorneys representing Gaines and Marshall. Their argument was equally straightforward. Margaret was property. The Fugitive Slave Act superseded state law. She had no trial right. She had no rights whatsoever. The murder charge was irrelevant because the victim, Mary, was also property. And one piece of property couldn't murder another. It was a legal impossibility. The trial extended for weeks. Witnesses were summoned. Testimonies were presented. Legal precedents were referenced. The marshals who'd been present at the cabin described what they'd witnessed, their accounts varying dramatically depending on who was inquiring. Some claimed Margaret had been calm, methodical, clearly controlling her actions. Others claimed she'd been hysterical, screaming beyond reason with fear. Elijah Kite testified that he'd had no awareness Margaret was planning violence, that he'd only been attempting to assist a family in need. Gaines testified that Margaret had always been troublesome, that she'd been insolent and defiant, that he'd been planning to sell her south because she was a negative influence on the other slaves. Margaret herself was not permitted to testify. Under both federal and Kentucky law, enslaved people could not provide testimony in court. Their words carried no legal weight. They could be discussed, but not heard. So Margaret sat in silence day after day, listening to people debate her humanity as though she weren't present. The abolitionists rallied around her. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, attended the trial and subsequently wrote about Margaret in her diary, describing her as a woman of extraordinary courage and tragic circumstance. Frederick Douglass published an editorial in his newspaper, The North Star, arguing that Margaret's actions were a damning indictment of slavery itself. What kind of system, he wrote, drives a mother to kill her own child rather than see the child enslaved? What kind of nation permits such a system to exist? But the pro-slavery press painted a different picture. The Louisville Courier labeled Margaret a savage and a beast in human form. The Richmond Enquirer argued that her actions proved enslaved. People were incapable of civilized behavior, that they required slavery's firm hand to keep them in check. This is what happens, one editorial stated. When Negroes are given ideas above their station, they become dangerous not just to themselves, but to society at large. The debate raged in newspapers, in churches, in homes across the country. Margaret Garner became a symbol, but nobody could agree on what she symbolized. Was she a victim or a villain? A martyr or a murderer? A human being or a piece of property? On February 26, 1856, after nearly a month of arguments, the judge ruled. Margaret and her family were to be returned to Kentucky. The murder charge was dismissed. The Fugitive Slave Act took precedence over state law. The federal government had prevailed. But the story didn't conclude there. The abolitionists weren't finished. They filed appeals, wrote letters to every politician they could contact, published editorials demanding justice. Margaret's case became a rallying cry. Am I not a woman and a sister? Read the pamphlets displaying Margaret's face alongside images of shackled hands. The question was rhetorical, but the answer, according to the law, was no. Jolliffe tried everything. He argued that the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional, that it violated Ohio's sovereignty, that it contradicted natural law's principles. He cited the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bible. He brought in expert witnesses, philosophers, theologians, anyone who might influence the court. But the law was clear, and the law didn't care about philosophy or theology. The law declared Margaret was property, and property had to be returned. Gaines and Marshall transported Margaret and her family back across the river in early March. The plan was to sell them south as rapidly as possible. Eliminate the evidence, erase the scandal, move forward. But the abolitionists had made Margaret famous, and fame complicated matters. Selling her publicly would cause an uproar. So Gaines decided to wait to let the attention subside before making his move. Margaret spent the following 2 months back at Maplewood, confined in a cabin under constant surveillance. She wasn't permitted to work in the fields or interact with the other slaves. She was kept isolated, a prisoner in the place she'd tried so desperately to escape. Robert and the children were kept separate, housed on Marshall's plantation, forbidden from seeing her. It was a punishment, a method of breaking her spirit, of making her regret what she'd done. But Margaret didn't regret it. She'd saved Mary. That's what she told herself repeatedly in that cabin's darkness. She'd saved her daughter from a life of rape and brutality and endless labor. She'd given her the only gift she had remaining to give, an escape. In March 1856, Gaines made his decision. He would sell Margaret, Robert, and the 3 surviving children to a plantation in the Deep South. The purchaser was a man named Judge Bonham, who owned a cotton plantation in Mississippi. The sale was arranged quietly without public announcement to avoid attracting attention. Margaret and her family were to be transported by steamboat down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, then south to New Orleans, where they would be transferred to Bonham's custody. On March 22, 1856, Margaret, Robert, and their 3 children were loaded onto a steamboat called the Henry Louis. The boat was transporting a cargo of cotton, livestock, and human beings. 37 enslaved people in total, all being transported south to new owners. Margaret was kept in chains, her hands and feet shackled to prevent any attempt at escape or violence. Robert was chained separately. The children were left unrestrained, but they were monitored constantly. The Henry Louis departed Cincinnati at dawn, heading downriver. The Ohio River was elevated with spring runoff, the current rapid and dangerous. The boat advanced quickly, its paddle wheel churning the brown water, its smokestacks belching black smoke into the gray sky. Margaret stood on the deck observing the shoreline pass by and thought about the river, about how close they'd come to freedom, about how the same water that had transported them toward hope was now transporting them toward hell. Somewhere near Louisville just after midnight on March 23, the Henry Louis collided with another steamboat, the Edward Howard. The collision was violent. The Edward Howard struck the Henry Louis broadside, tearing a hole in its hull and sending passengers and cargo tumbling into the water. The impact threw Margaret off her feet, and she fell hard against the deck railing. The chains on her wrists and ankles made it impossible to catch herself, and she tumbled over the side, plunging into the cold, dark water below. She was still holding baby Priscilla. Witnesses subsequently testified that Margaret had jumped. Others claimed she'd been knocked overboard by the collision, but everyone agreed on what happened next. Margaret held the baby underwater until she stopped struggling. By the time they were pulled from the river by crew members who jumped in after them, Priscilla was dead. Margaret was hauled back onto the boat soaking wet, her chains weighing her down, her face expressionless. She didn't resist. She didn't explain. She simply stared at the water as the boat continued south, leaving Priscilla's body behind to be recovered later by local authorities. The newspapers reported it as an accident. The official records listed Priscilla's death as drowning due to collision. No charges were filed. No investigation was conducted. Margaret had done it again, killed her own child, and this time nobody even pretended to care because by then she was in the Deep South, where the law was even less interested in the lives of enslaved people than it had been in Kentucky. Margaret was sold to Judge Bonham's plantation in Issaquah County, Mississippi, one of the richest and deadliest cotton-producing regions in the South. The plantation was enormous, more than 3,000 acres worked by 200 enslaved people. The mortality rate was staggering. Enslaved people lasted an average of 7 years in the Mississippi Delta before they died from disease, exhaustion, or violence. The land was fertile, but it was also a swamp thick with mosquitoes and disease, malaria, yellow fever, cholera. They swept through the slave quarters every summer, killing dozens at a time. Robert and the two boys, Thomas and Samuel, were sold separately. Robert was purchased by a plantation owner in Arkansas. Thomas and Samuel were sold to a man in Louisiana. The family was scattered across the Deep South, never to see each other again. That was standard practice. Separating families made them easier to control, less likely to resist. If you had nothing left to lose, you had nothing left to fight for. Margaret was put to work in the fields. Cotton picking was brutal labor. You worked from dawn until well after dark. Bent over in the sun, your hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, your back screaming in pain. The overseers were ruthless. They carried whips and used them liberally. If you didn't meet your quota, 100 pounds of cotton per day, you were beaten. If you talked back, you were beaten. If you looked at an overseer the wrong way, you were beaten. The violence was constant, casual, a fact of life. But Margaret didn't break. She worked in silence, her face blank, her movements mechanical. She didn't make friends. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She simply existed day after day, going through the motions of survival without any real hope of living. The other enslaved people on the plantation whispered about her. They knew her story. Word had spread through the underground network of communication that connected plantations across the South. They knew she'd killed her children rather than let them be enslaved. Some admired her for it, others were horrified. But everyone understood because they all knew what slavery was. They all knew what it did to people. Margaret lasted fewer than 12 months. In the summer of 1857, a cholera outbreak swept through the plantation. Dozens of people died, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the property. Margaret contracted the disease in late August. She was sick for 3 weeks, burning with fever, unable to keep food down, her body wasting away. The plantation doctor, a white man who treated enslaved people the way a veterinarian treats livestock, didn't bother trying to save her. Cholera was a death sentence, and enslaved people weren't worth the cost of medicine. Margaret died on September 14, 1857. She was 23 years old. Her death was recorded in a single line in the plantation ledger. Margaret, deceased, cholera. No grave was marked. No funeral was held. Her body was wrapped in a sheet and buried in the same mass grave as the others who died that summer. She simply disappeared the way so many enslaved people disappeared, erased from history as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. But Margaret's story didn't disappear. The trial transcripts, though heavily edited, survived. The newspaper articles, though biased, were preserved. And the question she'd forced the nation to confront, whether an enslaved mother had the right to choose death over bondage for her children, lingered long after her body was buried in an unmarked grave. Abolitionists invoked her name in speeches. Harriet Beecher Stowe cited Margaret's case as inspiration for her later work, writing about the impossible choices slavery forced on mothers. Frederick Douglass wrote about her in his autobiography, calling her a woman who loved her children more than life itself. William Lloyd Garrison published editorials demanding that her story be remembered, that her sacrifice not be forgotten. But the pro-slavery press painted her as a monster, a cautionary tale of what happened when enslaved people were given ideas above their station. The Charleston Mercury ran an editorial arguing that Margaret's actions proved black people were inherently violent and needed the civilizing influence of slavery. The New Orleans Picayune called her an example of savage barbarism and used her case to argue against abolition. The Civil War arrived 4 years following Margaret's death. Slavery was abolished in 1865. But the question Margaret had posed, whether freedom was worth dying for, whether death was preferable to bondage, was never truly answered. It was buried along with her body in the soil of a country that didn't want to remember. What the history books omit is that Margaret Garner's case triggered a chain reaction nobody anticipated. Her trial became a flashpoint, an instant when the carefully constructed legal fiction of slavery, the notion that human beings could be property, collided with reality in a manner that couldn't be ignored. In the months following her return to Kentucky, abolitionist groups across the North utilized her case as propaganda. They printed pamphlets bearing her face, distributed them at churches and town halls, used her story to recruit new members to the cause. This is what slavery accomplishes. The pamphlets stated, "This is the system you are supporting with your silence." In the South, the reaction was equally powerful but opposite. Pro-slavery politicians utilized Margaret as evidence that enslaved people were dangerous, that they needed to be controlled more strictly, that any loosening of the laws would lead to violence and chaos. New legislation was proposed in Kentucky and other border states, tightening restrictions on enslaved people's movements, increasing penalties for those who helped runaways, making it even harder to escape. The case also revealed deep divisions within the abolitionist movement itself. Some abolitionists celebrated Margaret as a hero, a woman who'd made the ultimate sacrifice to save her children from slavery. Others were uncomfortable with that narrative, worried that glorifying infanticide would damage the cause, would provide ammunition to pro-slavery advocates who argued that black people were violent and uncivilized. There were heated debates in abolitionist newspapers and at meetings. Some argued that Margaret's actions were justified, that she'd done the only thing she could do in an impossible situation. Others argued that she should have trusted in God, that she should have had faith that freedom would come eventually, that killing her children was a sin no matter the circumstances. But what none of them understood, what none of them could understand because they'd never been enslaved, was that Margaret hadn't acted out of desperation or madness. She'd acted out of knowledge. She knew precisely what slavery was. She'd lived it every day of her life. She'd been raped by her master's son. She'd watched her mother be raped. She'd seen children torn from their mother's arms.